April 1885. The open plains of the Canadian West. History often calls this a rebellion that collapsed, a brief flare of violence, a failed revolt. But that explanation is too comfortable because this moment did not fail. It closed something forever. This channel tells historical war stories without mythology. No simple heroes, no easy villains. We focus on pressure instead of passion, on systems instead of speeches, on moments where history narrowed, and one future quietly defeated all others. Because the most important conflicts are not always the loudest ones. This is not just the story of Louis Riel, and it is not merely the story of Canada enforcing law and order. This is the story of why resistance sometimes collapses even when it is justified, why moral claims do not always translate into political outcomes, and why, after 1885, the Canadian West would never again be negotiated on equal terms. This isn't about why the rebellion happened, it's about why it could no longer succeed. To understand the Northwest Rebellion, you must understand scale. In the 1880s, Canada was a young country attempting something enormous. It was trying to transform a continent into an administrative system. Ottawa governed with paper, maps, surveys, legal definitions, but west of Manitoba, the land did not operate on paper. The prairies were vast, seasonal, and relational. People moved with weather, with herds, with rivers. The Métis people emerged from this world. They were not outsiders. They were not temporary occupants. They had lived there for generations. Their farms followed riverbanks in narrow strips. Their hunting followed the bison across enormous distances. Their economy depended on flexibility. This was not chaos, it was a different logic. But Canada's national vision had no space for that logic. The country's survival depended on settlement. Settlement required certainty. Certainty required ownership. Land had to be surveyed into squares, registered, taxed, sold. Anything that could not be measured became unstable. When Canada acquired the Northwest Territories, it inherited communities without integrating them. The Métis asked a simple question: where do we belong in this new country? They sent petitions asking for land titles, for recognition of their farms, for legal clarity. The federal response was not openly hostile. It was slow, files stalled in offices. Surveys were conducted without consultation. New settlers arrived with legal claims that ignored existing realities. For the Métis, time itself became a threat. Every year without recognition meant more land lost, more farms displaced, more authorities slipping away. At the same time, First Nations communities were pushed into dependency. Treaties promised food, assistance, and protection, but rations were withheld to enforce compliance. Starvation became a tool of governance. The West was not erupting, it was suffocating. Louis Riel returned to the West in 1884. This moment is often portrayed as the beginning of rebellion, but that interpretation misses the deeper reality. Riel did not arrive as a revolutionary, he arrived as a negotiator. The Métis asked him to help organize their demands, to give voice to grievances already widely shared. At first, Riel focused on politics. Committees were formed, petitions were drafted, delegates were chosen. The demands were not radical. They asked for land security, local self-government, cultural recognition. These were requests for inclusion, not separation. But Ottawa hesitated again, and delay, under these conditions, was not neutral. It signaled indifference. Worse, it signaled that the system no longer felt threatened by protest. As months passed, frustration hardened. Local defense groups formed. Weapons were gathered not for war, but for leverage. Riel's language began to change. Not suddenly, not theatrically, but under pressure. He began to speak in absolutes. In moral terms, in religious language that reflected desperation more than ambition. This shift unsettled even his supporters, but it revealed something critical. Political tools were losing effectiveness. And when politics fails repeatedly, it leaves behind a vacuum. That vacuum rarely stays empty. By early 1885, the situation crossed a threshold. The Métis provisional government was declared. This was not an act of independence, it was a demand to be recognized as legitimate. Ottawa's response was decisive. For the first time, Canada mobilized the West as a military problem. This decision mattered more than any individual battle. The Canadian Pacific Railway was incomplete but functional enough. Troops were moved west faster than ever before in Canadian history. This was a quiet revolution. For the first time, the Canadian state could project force rapidly across its territory. The rebellion became a test not of ideology but of infrastructure. Early clashes showed the imbalance clearly. At Duck Lake, Métis fighters defeated government forces using superior knowledge of terrain. At Fish Creek, they delayed a much larger army. These were not symbolic victories, they were real. But they came at a cost. Every bullet fired mattered. Every wounded fighter reduced strength permanently. The Metis had no factories, no supply depots, no reinforcements waiting behind the horizon. Canada did, and Ottawa understood something essential. It did not need to win quickly, it only needed to last longer. Federal commanders avoided unnecessary risks. They advanced slowly. They waited for supplies. This was not dramatic warfare. It was procedural, and procedure favors states. Batashi was not chosen as the final stand. It became the final stand because everything else collapsed around it. As Canadian forces approached, conditions inside the settlement deteriorated. Ammunition ran low. Food supplies thinned. Confidence fractured. Riel's authority weakened as desperation grew. When the final assault began, it was disorganized. Militia units advanced unevenly. Command structures broke down. But chaos favored the side with numbers. And when the shooting stopped, the result was clear. The resistance did not end in glory. It ended in exhaustion. Days later, Louis Riel surrendered. There was no defiant speech, no dramatic capture, only recognition. The moment had passed. Riel's trial moved quickly. The verdict was never truly in doubt. Executing Riel was not about justice. It was about certainty. The Canadian government needed to demonstrate that resistance would not reshape national direction. And it succeeded. After 1885, hesitation disappeared. Railways were completed. Western provinces were organized. Administrative control tightened. Metis land claims dissolved into legal confusion. First Nations resistance was managed through policy, dependency, and surveillance. The rebellion did not fail because it was wrong. It failed because the system it challenged had already consolidated power. This was the moment Canada stopped negotiating its Western future. From then on, expansion was assumed, and assumptions are rarely questioned. The Northwest Rebellion was not a tragic misunderstanding. It was a collision between lived reality and institutional momentum. History often remembers who won, but the deeper lesson lies in how inevitability is manufactured. If you want more stories like this, stories about forgotten conflicts, silent decisions, and moments where history narrowed, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments, which overlooked war story should we uncover next? Because some endings only look inevitable after they happen.